You think you know power. The Galactic Dominion measured civilization by the purity of their plasma arrays, the flawless symmetry of their Dyson spheres. The Dominion thought humanity was a joke, a dirt-bound species strapping chemical rockets to exploding tin cans. But when Inspector Vincent stepped onto their flagship, the air tasted like ozone and stale blood. They weren't using antimatter. They were burning reality itself. Prepare yourself, because what he saw in that human engine room didn't just break the laws of physics. It broke his mind. The airlock of the human vessel didn't hiss open with the graceful, pneumatic sigh Vincent was accustomed to. It screamed. Metal ground against unlubricated metal, a high-pitched, agonizing shriek that vibrated straight through the soles of his polished boots and settled in his dental work. He stood in the docking umbilical, adjusting the collar of his Dominion inspector's uniform. For 60 standard years, Vincent had evaluated the technological viability of newly spacefaring species. He had seen crystalline dreadnoughts that sang in harmony with solar winds. He had walked the polished obsidian decks of the deep-core hive minds. He thought he had seen the pinnacle of engineering, and conversely, the absolute dregs of backwater desperation. Then he boarded the UNS Dauntless. The heavy steel door finally shuttered open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit corridor. The atmospheric exchange slapped him in the face. It wasn't the sterile, temperature-controlled, scentless air of a Dominion cruiser. It was thick. It smelled of oxidized copper, sour sweat, burnt synthetic rubber, and something sharp and bitter that he would later learn was roasted coffee. It was the scent of desperation and frantic, messy life. Waiting for him was Captain Harris. He didn't wear a pressed dress uniform or ceremonial robes. He wore a faded blue jumpsuit, the sleeves rolled up to reveal pale, scarred forearms. A smear of black grease decorated his left jawline. He was chewing on a fibrous stick. "Inspector Vincent," Harris said, extending a calloused hand. His voice was gravelly, lacking the melodic synthesis of an implanted translator. He was speaking raw, unedited English, forcing Vincent's own neural lace to do the heavy lifting. "Welcome to the Dauntless." Vincent did not take his hand. He nodded, a stiff, calculated gesture of superiority. "Captain Harris, let us forgo the pleasantries. I am here to conduct the baseline compliance audit for the Dominion Council. Your species has petitioned for Tier 2 trade access. Frankly, looking at the exterior of this vessel, I am astounded you made it past your own moon." Harris didn't flinch. He just lowered his hand, a slow, infuriating smirk touching the corners of his mouth. "She ain't much to look at from the outside, but she gets us there. Follow me, Inspector. Watch your head on the bulkheads." Vincent followed him down the corridor. The ship felt alive, but not in the symbiotic, bioengineered way of the higher races. It felt alive like a diseased animal. The deck plates vibrated with a constant arrhythmic thrum. The overhead lighting, caged behind wire mesh, flickered with a 60 hertz buzz that immediately gave Vincent a dull headache behind his eyes. Bundles of exposed cabling ran along the ceiling like exposed veins, wrapped in cheap synthetic adhesives. It was a disaster. It was an insult to the sacred geometry of spaceflight. Vincent pulled out his datapad, intending to log a critical failure for exposed electrical routing. The moment he activated the screen, the display flickered, fractured into a kaleidoscope of static, and died. He tapped the glass. Nothing. He looked up at Harris, who was glancing back over his shoulder. "Sorry about that," Harris said, not sounding sorry at all. "Should have warned you. The localized magnetic shielding in the outer corridors is a bit leaky. Tends to fry unshielded consumer tech." "This is not consumer tech," Vincent snapped, his heart rate spiking with sudden, irrational irritation. "This is a Dominion surveyor pad. It is hardened against localized EMPs and solar radiation." "Yeah, well," Harris shrugged, turning a corner into an even narrower maintenance shaft. "It ain't hardened against us. Keep it in your pocket unless you want the battery to spontaneously vent." Vincent slid the dead slate into his coat. His skin crawled. The air temperature was dropping the deeper they went into the ship. The smell of sweat and coffee faded, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. It tasted like putting a tongue on a raw battery terminal. This was Vincent's first internal contradiction, the first crack in his absolute certainty. Dominion ships pushed radiation outward. They were perfectly insulated bubbles. The inside of a ship should be inert. But here, the ambient energy was bleeding inward. It felt like walking down the throat of a predator that hadn't quite decided whether or not to swallow. "Where are you taking me, Captain?" Vincent asked, struggling to keep his voice flat, masking the slight tremor in his breath. "You're an inspector," Harris said, keying a heavy blast door control panel with a series of physical button presses. Physical buttons. Vincent hadn't seen those on a starship in centuries. "You want to see if we're up to code. I figured we'd skip the mess hall and the crew quarters and go straight to the heart of the matter. Welcome to engineering." The heavy blast doors didn't slide. They retracted vertically, slamming into the ceiling with a concussive thud that knocked dust loose from the vents. The sound hit him first. It wasn't a mechanical roar. It wasn't the harmonic hum of a fusion reactor or the deep, resonant bass of an antimatter containment field. It was a scream, a physical tearing sound, like wet canvas being ripped apart, layered over a high-frequency whine that made his teeth ache. Vincent stepped into the cavernous room, and for the first time in his long, arrogant life, he felt the cold, creeping sensation of absolute primal terror. The engineering bay of the Dauntless was a cathedral of blasphemy. It was massive, spanning 3 decks in height, a chaotic tangle of catwalks, coolant pipes the size of ancient aqueducts, and structural support beams that looked entirely insufficient for the mass they were bearing. Condensation dripped from the ceiling, hissing as it struck hot pipes, filling the air with a hazy, acidic fog. Standing on a central platform, screaming orders into a headset, was a human woman covered in soot and thermal paste. "Riley!" Harris shouted over the deafening, tearing noise. The woman turned, wiped a smear of black grease from her forehead, and jogged over to them. She looked exhausted. Her eyes were bloodshot, her uniform stained. "Captain," she said, giving a half-hearted salute. She eyed Vincent up and down. "This the auditor?" "Inspector Vincent, Chief Engineer Riley," Harris introduced them. "How's the girl holding up?" "We're running at 80% nominal," Riley yelled, though the tearing sound seemed to swallow her words. "Had to jury-rig the tertiary coolant loop with duct tape and a prayer, but the containment field is holding." Vincent stared at her. Duct tape? His translator struggled with the concept. A primitive adhesive strip, used on a starship's primary coolant system. It was sheer lunacy. But his shock at their maintenance protocols evaporated the moment he looked past her, toward the center of the room. Dominion power cores were beautiful. They used zero-point plasma modules contained in spheres of perfectly polished hyperglass. They glowed with a soft, warm golden light. They were silent. They were safe. The thing in the center of the human engineering bay was not a sphere. It was an absence. It was suspended in a cage of heavy, oscillating magnetic rings that were spinning so fast they blurred into a solid cylinder of gray metal. But inside the rings, there was no light. It was a jagged, tear-shaped void about 3 meters across. It was blacker than the vacuum of space. It didn't just lack light, it seemed to actively consume it. The edges of the void were fractal, shimmering with a sickly, bruised purple corona that hurt his eyes to look at. The cold emanating from it was unnatural. Frost crept up the deck plates leading toward the containment cage. The air around it was warping, bending the light of the harsh overhead lamps into sickening curved funnels. "What?" Vincent's voice caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe. The air in his lungs felt heavy, like it was trying to drag him forward, toward the cage. "What is that?" Riley looked at it, then back at him, a proud, exhausted grin on her face. That's the gravitic shear displacement drive. We just call her the blender." "That is not a fusion reactor," Vincent whispered, stepping back. His boot hit a loose grate, but he didn't care. He needed to be further away from it. "Fusion?" Harris laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "No, fusion is for generating electricity. It's too slow for FTL propulsion. You Dominion folks use what? Hyperspace slipstreams? Pushing your way into a higher dimension? It is the only mathematically sound method of traversing interstellar distances without violating the causality of the universe," Vincent recited mechanically, his eyes locked on the jagged black tear. "Yeah, well, we didn't have 1,000 years to figure out the math of higher dimensions," Riley said, leaning against a railing. "So we just looked at the dimension we were already in and decided to break it." "Break it?" Vincent gasped. "It's a localized, artificially sustained, naked singularity," Harris said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "We use an array of focused gravity lasers to pinch the fabric of space-time until it fractures. Then, we pump a continuous stream of heavy isotopes into the fracture to keep it from healing." Vincent's mind reeled. A naked singularity. An event horizon without mass, a paradox, a literal impossibility that defied every law of thermodynamics, causality, and sanity. The Dominion had hypothesized such things existed only at the death of the universe. To create one, let alone trap it inside a metal cage aboard a moving vessel. You are using a tear in reality as an engine?" Vincent asked, his voice trembling. "Not exactly," Riley corrected, tapping a pressure gauge with a wrench. The glass was cracked. "The tear itself just sits there. It's the friction we use. Reality naturally tries to heal the fracture. It pushes back. The singularity pulls in. That conflict generates an infinite well of kinetic friction. We bleed off the thermal radiation from the friction, convert it into raw thrust, and use the gravitational shear to literally drag the ship across real space." Vincent felt bile rise in his throat. They weren't slipping gracefully through the cosmos. They were tearing a bleeding wound in the fabric of the universe, throwing garbage into it to keep it open, and riding the agony of reality's desperate attempt to heal itself. "It's monstrous," Vincent breathed. "It is mathematically abhorrent. the sheer instability. If your containment field drops for a microsecond, that singularity will expand. It will swallow this ship, your fleet, your entire solar system. Harris scratched his chin. Yeah, we calculated that. That's why we have the secondary magnetic locks. And if those fail, Vincent demanded, his voice rising in a panic he could no longer suppress. That's what the duct tape is for, Riley said, deadpan. Vincent stared at them. They were insane. The entire species was a collection of suicidal apes playing with cosmic fire. He reached into his coat, his fingers shaking, wanting to grab his datapad to log the immediate quarantine and destruction of this vessel, only to remember the machine was dead, killed by the ambient radiation of their own madness. You cannot operate this, Vincent said, trying to regain his authority. The Dominion will not allow a Tier 2 species to possess reality-shearing technology. It is a violation of the primary accords. Harris stepped closer to him. The smell of his stale coffee and sweat overpowered the ozone for a brief second. His eyes were hard, devoid of the jovial sarcasm from the docking bay. "Inspector," Harris said quietly, his voice cutting through the tearing sound of the engine. "We didn't petition the Dominion for trade access so you could tell us how to fly our ships. We petitioned because we have an excess of heavy metals we want to trade for your hydroponic tech. We aren't asking for your permission to exist. The Council took 10,000 years to map the Orion Spur," Harris interrupted. "We did it in 50, because we don't wait for the math to be perfect. If a door is locked, we don't spend centuries looking for the key. We blow the door off its hinges." He turned away, looking up at Riley. "Chief, spool up the blender. Let's show the inspector how we get from point A to point B." "Wait, what?" Vincent stumbled backward. "Spinning up!" Riley yelled, ignoring him. She slammed a heavy red physical lever forward. The tearing sound doubled in volume. The bridge of the Dauntless was no better than the engineering bay. Vincent was dragged up there by Harris, his legs feeling like they were made of lead, his mind trapped in a loop of panicked calculations. A naked singularity. They were riding a naked singularity. The bridge was cramped, circular, and reeked of stale breath and adrenaline. There were no holographic displays, no neural interface couches. The crew sat in utilitarian metal chairs bolted to the deck, staring at flat glass screens and typing furiously on mechanical keyboards. The clack, clack, clack of the keys sounded like hail on a tin roof, frantic and chaotic. "Navigation," Harris barked, strapping himself into the center seat. "Give me a firing solution for the Cygnus outpost." A young man at the front desk, barely out of adolescence, his face pale in the glow of his monitor, didn't look up. "Calculating shear vectors, Captain. Compensating for stellar drift. Locking in coordinates." Vincent gripped the metal railing behind Harris's chair. "Captain, you cannot execute an FTL jump this deep inside a planetary gravity well. The Dominion mandates a minimum distance of 3 astronomical units from any celestial body before engaging slipstream. The interference—" "We don't use slipstream, Inspector," Harris said, not looking back at him. "And we don't care about gravity wells. Our engine is a gravity well." He leaned forward. "All hands, brace for shear." On a Dominion vessel, jumping to FTL was a serene experience. The lights dimmed slightly, a soft harmonic chime rang through the ship, and the stars outside the view screen gently stretched into elegant lines of light as the ship phased out of standard reality. It was a transition of grace. The human method was an act of extreme violence. "Punch it," Harris ordered. The navigator hit a glowing green button on his console. Vincent didn't see the stars stretch. He didn't hear a chime. Instead, the universe simply broke. The first sensation was a physical blow to his chest, as if he had been struck by a solid wall of air. The breath was violently forced from his lungs. He clamped his hands over his ears as the sound from the engine room amplified, echoing through the hull until it wasn't a sound anymore, but a physical vibration grinding his bones against each other. Then his sensory input collapsed. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, his optic nerves misfired. He tasted the color blue, a sharp metallic blue that tasted like copper pennies. He heard the smell of burning dust. His internal organs felt as though they had been abruptly inverted, untethered from gravity, and smeared across the bulkhead. Through the forward viewports, space didn't warp. It shattered. Black cracks appeared in the vacuum outside, glowing with that same bruised purple light he had seen in the engine core. The ship groaned, the steel hull shrieking as it was subjected to impossible torsional forces. The Dauntless wasn't moving through space. It was digging its jagged claws into the fabric of the universe and violently ripping reality backward, pulling its destination toward it. Vincent fell to his knees, gagging. The taste of bile mixed with the phantom taste of blue copper. He closed his eyes, but the fractured purple reality burned through his eyelids. He felt his sanity fraying, his deep-seated dominion logic crying out in horror at the mathematical atrocities being committed in real time around him. They were going to die. The hull would crush. The singularity would consume them. And then, as suddenly as it began, the violence stopped. Gravity slammed back into place, pinning Vincent to the cold steel deck. The tearing sound subsided into a low, rumbling hum. The taste of copper vanished, replaced by the mundane, sharp stench of his own sweat and the ship's recycled air. He stayed on the floor, gasping for breath, his chest heaving. His uniform was soaked. "Jump complete, Captain," the young navigator said, his voice completely steady, punctuated only by the click-clack of him saving his telemetry data. "We are in geostationary orbit over Cygnus Outpost." "Time elapsed?" Harris asked. 0.004 seconds, sir." 0.004 seconds. Instantaneous transit. Cygnus was 12 light-years away. A Dominion cruiser, utilizing the most mathematically perfect slipstream drives ever conceived, would take 3 days to make that transit. Vincent dragged himself up, his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles ached. He looked out the forward viewport. There it was, the Cygnus outpost, a rotating silver wheel hanging lazily against the backdrop of a red nebula. They hadn't traveled. They had forced the universe to move out of their way. Harris unbuckled himself, stood up, and walked over to a small, stained machine on the bulkhead. He pressed a button, and a black, sludge-like liquid poured into a ceramic mug. He took a sip, sighed, and finally looked down at Vincent. "First time is always a little rough on the stomach," Harris said, offering a rag he pulled from his pocket. "You get used to it around jump 4 or 5. Vincent stared at the rag, then up at Harris's face. He wasn't a god. He wasn't a transcendent being of pure energy. He was a tired, dirty man drinking bitter liquid on a ship held together by primitive adhesives, wielding the power to unmake creation itself. "You," Vincent choked out, his voice raspy. "You tore the universe apart and stitched it back together just to move your ship." "Like I said, Inspector," Harris smiled, a cynical, weary expression that sent a profound chill down Vincent's spine. "We don't wait for the door to open. Now, how about we sit down and talk about that Tier 2 trade access?" Vincent realized then, looking at him, that the Dominion Council was obsolete. Their perfect plasma arrays, their flawless Dyson spheres, their 10,000 years of elegant math. It was all meaningless. The Dominion had spent millennia learning to sail the ocean. Humanity had just shown up and drank the water. Vincent's knees still felt like water when the Dauntless clamped onto the Cygnus outpost docking ring. There was no gentle magnetic alignment, no seamless integration of airlocks. There was a dull, echoing clang that vibrated through the bulkheads, followed by the grinding of mechanical locking clamps physically biting into the station's outer hull. He stood in the corridor behind Captain Harris, trying to smooth the wrinkles out of his uniform. His hands were shaking. He hid them behind his back. The blast doors parted, revealing the pristine, sterile environment of the Dominion outpost. Cygnus was a masterpiece of Tier 1 architecture. The walls were extruded pearl resin, glowing with internal bioluminescent light. The air smelled of filtered ozone and a faint, engineered citrus scent designed to promote calmness. The gravity was uniformly perfect. Then, the human crew stepped through. Harris led the way, flanked by two burly crewmen, Jenkins and Miller, their names stenciled on the breasts of their grease-stained jumpsuits. They were pushing heavy, wheeled pallets loaded with cargo. The squeak of an unlubricated wheel on the pristine resin floor sounded like a dying bird. They left scuff marks. They brought the smell of the Dauntless with them. That suffocating blend of oxidized iron, old sweat, and the lingering metallic tang of the reality-shearing drive. Waiting for them was Administrator Hayes. Despite the Western name, a concession to his station's sector assignment, he was purely Dominion. He wore the flowing silver robes of a logistics prefect, his face a mask of engineered, ageless serenity. That serenity cracked the moment he saw them, or rather, the moment he smelled them. "Inspector Vincent," Hayes said, his voice tight, his eyes darting to the dirt on Harris's boots. "You are early." The tracking grid did not register an approaching slipstream wake. "There was no wake, Administrator," Vincent said. His voice sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "They do not use slipstream." Hayes frowned, a subtle tightening of his brow. He looked at Harris. "Captain, you are aware that bringing unsterilized cargo containers onto a Tier 1 concourse is a violation of protocol?" "Protocol's great when you have time for it, Hayes," Harris grunted, not bothering with a formal title. He slapped a hand against the nearest metal crate. The sound was flat and dense. "I brought what we agreed on. 3 tons of refined iridium, 4 tons of raw tungsten, and a locked crate of stable heavy isotopes that your engineers are going to wet their robes over." Hayes recoiled slightly. "You transported highly volatile isotopes through a populated sector. It's in a lead-lined box, mostly," Harris said, waving off the concern. "Now, where are the hydroponic arrays? We're on a schedule." Vincent watched this exchange with a mounting sense of unreality. Hayes was a Dominion prefect. He commanded the orbital defenses of an entire sector. He could vaporize the Dauntless with a single, softly spoken command. Yet, he was backing away from a man who looked like he had just crawled out of a maintenance shaft. "The agricultural units are in loading bay 4, Hayes stammered, clearly thrown off balance by Harris's aggressive, informal momentum. However, Inspector Vincent has not yet submitted his compliance audit. The exchange cannot legally proceed until humanity is certified as a Tier 2 species." Both men turned to look at Vincent. The silence in the corridor was heavy. The Dominion way would be to deny them, to cite the exposed wiring, the lethal radiation levels, and the outright psychotic nature of their propulsion system, to quarantine the ship and arrest the crew for crimes against the fabric of space-time. Vincent opened his mouth to do just that. He looked at Hayes, expecting to see the backing of the Empire in his eyes, but then he looked at the human crewman. Jenkins was leaning against his cart, chewing on a fingernail, looking completely unimpressed by the glowing pearl walls. Miller was adjusting a primitive, combustion-driven sidearm strapped to his thigh. They weren't intimidated. They were annoyed by the delay. If a door is locked, we blow it off its hinges. If he denied them, they wouldn't quietly return to their dirtball of a planet. They would just leave. They would rip another hole in reality, bypass the outpost entirely, and start taking what they wanted from the frontier colonies. The Dominion's perfect defenses were designed to intercept ships traveling through higher dimensions. They had no defenses against a ship that simply stitched itself from one point in real space to another. The Dominion couldn't track them. They couldn't stop them. "The audit is incomplete," Vincent found himself saying, the lie tasting like ash in his throat. "However, a preliminary waiver can be granted for this specific transaction. Given the unique nature of their technology, a full review will take time." Hayes looked shocked. "Inspector, are you certain?" "Process the trade, Administrator," Vincent said coldly, adopting his most authoritative tone to mask his terror. Harris gave him a slow, knowing look. He didn't smile, but there was a glint of predatory understanding in his eyes. He knew exactly why Vincent had folded. "You heard the man," Harris told his crew. "Haul it to Bay 4. Let's get our dirt makers and get the hell out of this sterile coffin." As the humans rolled their screeching carts past the horrified administrator, Vincent realized he was no longer an inspector evaluating a lesser species. He was a hostage to a paradigm shift. The return to the Dauntless felt like walking into a furnace. They had barely detached from the Cygnus outpost when the ship-wide alarms triggered. They weren't the soft, pulsing chimes of a Dominion vessel alerting the crew to a minor course correction. It was a physical, clanging bell, accompanied by a strobe of harsh red light that immediately gave Vincent a migraine. "We got a pressure spike in the secondary coolant loop." Riley's voice crackled over the ship's antiquated intercom, barely audible over the sudden, violent shuddering of the deck plates. "The blender is running hot. She didn't like sitting in that gravity well." Harris was already sprinting down the corridor, his boots slamming against the grated floor. Vincent followed him, not out of bravery, but because the primal fear of being left alone on this doomed ship overrode his common sense. When they reached engineering, the air was unbreathable. It tasted of sulfur and burning rubber. The temperature had spiked by at least 20 degrees. The hazy fog of condensation had turned into a thick, scalding steam that obscured the upper catwalks. In the center of the room, the singularity containment cage was screaming. The heavy magnetic rings were spinning, but their rotation was erratic, stuttering with sickening heavy clunks. Inside the cage, the jagged black tear in reality was larger. The bruised purple corona had intensified into a blinding, violent violet, casting frantic shadows against the bulkheads. Reality was pushing back. The universe was trying to heal the wound, and the friction was generating enough thermal energy to melt the ship from the inside out. "Coolant pressure is dropping!" a technician shouted from a lower console, coughing violently into a rag. "Where's the leak?" Harris roared, grabbing a heavy thermal coat from a wall hook and throwing it on. "Node 4, the physical valve is jammed open," Riley yelled back. She was halfway up a ladder, climbing toward a massive, frost-covered pipe that hung precariously close to the spinning magnetic cage. Vincent stood frozen in the doorway. His Dominion training screamed at him to evacuate, to seal the bulkheads and wait for the inevitable core breach. But there were no escape pods on the Dauntless. He knew that now. These people flew without parachutes. He watched as Riley reached the catwalk. Steam was violently venting from a massive iron valve wheel. It wasn't a digital relay. It wasn't a remote-controlled servo. It was a solid, rusted wheel of metal that required manual, physical force to turn. Riley grabbed it with both hands, her thick gloves smoking instantly upon contact with the superheated metal. She strained, the muscles in her back cording visibly through her soaked uniform. The wheel didn't budge. "It's fused!" she screamed, her voice cracking in panic. The purple light of the singularity flared. A localized gravity wave washed over the room. Vincent's knees buckled, and he was slammed face first into the metal grating. He tasted blood, his own. He gasped, feeling the air being pulled out of his lungs, dragged toward the black void in the cage. Loose tools, data pads, and loose bolts began to slide across the floor, rattling upward toward the anomaly. "Donovan!" Harris barked. A massive, heavy-set crewman lumbered past Vincent. He didn't bother with a thermal coat. He had a heavy steel wrench in his hands, nearly a meter long. He climbed the ladder with terrifying speed, ignoring the blistering heat. When he reached Riley, he shoved her aside. He jammed the wrench between the spokes of the iron wheel, using it as a lever. "Pull!" Donovan roared. Riley grabbed the end of the wrench with him. Harris, who had climbed up behind them, grabbed it too. 3 humans, throwing their raw, biological weight against a seized piece of iron, fighting the cosmic pressure of a fractured universe. Vincent watched Donovan's bare forearms blister. The ambient radiation from the flaring singularity was literally cooking his skin. He didn't let go. His face was contorted in a snarl of pure, animalistic defiance, spit flying from his lips as he strained. Crack! The sound of the rusted iron giving way echoed like a gunshot. The wheel spun. The venting steam cut off with a violent hiss. Instantly, a deep, resonant thud echoed through the ship as the coolant flooded back into the primary loop. The magnetic rings stabilized, their stuttering rotation smoothing out into a blur. The violent purple light shrank back into a sullen, sickly corona around the void. Gravity snapped back to normal, dropping Vincent flat against the grating once more. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged, wheezing gasps of the crew and the constant underlying tearing sound of the drive. Donovan collapsed onto the catwalk. Riley slumped against the railing, tearing her smoking gloves off and throwing them onto the lower deck. Vincent pulled himself up. His nose was bleeding. He wiped it with the back of his perfectly manicured hand, staring at the bright red smear. Dominion blood was blue, copper-based. But right now, standing in the heat and the stench of this metal coffin, he felt thoroughly, disgustingly human. Harris climbed down the ladder slowly. He looked exhausted. He walked over to Vincent, glancing at the blood on his face, and then at the massive wrench still jutting from the valve wheel. "See, Inspector," Harris said, his chest heaving, a bitter, grim smile on his face. "That's why we don't use digital servos for the critical systems. When the math breaks down and the universe decides it wants you dead, you can't logic your way out of it. Sometimes you just need a really big lever." Vincent looked at him. He looked at Donovan, who was being helped down the ladder, his arms wrapped in makeshift chemical burns bandages, leaving drops of dark red blood on the steel steps. "You are animals," Vincent whispered, the words lacking any of the superiority they would have held yesterday. It wasn't an insult anymore. It was an observation. "Yeah," Harris agreed, wiping soot from his eyes. "And the universe is a jungle. Come on, let's get you a drink. You look like you're going into shock." The ship's medical bay was a converted storage closet. It smelled heavily of isopropyl alcohol, burnt flesh, and old metallic blood. There was no automated diagnostic bed, no soothing harmonic tissue regenerators. There was a metal table, a harsh overhead spotlight, and Dr. Evans, a grim-faced woman with tired eyes, who was currently stapling Donovan's blistered skin back together with a mechanical suture gun. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of the staples biting into flesh made Vincent's stomach churn. Donovan just sat there, grinding his teeth, a damp rag stuffed in his mouth. Harris sat across from Vincent in a cramped alcove just outside the med bay, separated by a thin plastic curtain. He had produced a glass bottle containing an amber liquid. He poured 2 measures into dented steel cups and shoved one across the small table toward the inspector. "Drink," he commanded. "It's bourbon, distilled back on Earth. It'll settle your nerves." Vincent stared at the liquid. He didn't drink ethanol. Dominion physiology found it mildly toxic and entirely unnecessary. But his hands were still shaking from the gravity wave, and the metallic taste of the singularity was still coated on the back of his tongue. He picked up the cup and threw it back. It felt like swallowing liquid fire. He coughed violently, his eyes watering, his chest burning. Harris took a slow sip of his own, savoring it. "Why?" Vincent finally asked, his voice raspy from the alcohol. The question had been burning in his mind since he stepped onto the ship. "Why do you do this? The Dominion could have provided you with slower, safer drives. You could map your local cluster over the next millennium. You don't have to tear reality apart. You don't have to burn yourselves alive." Harris set his cup down. He looked at his hands. They were covered in small white scars, calluses, and the faint, permanent discoloration of radiation exposure. "Inspector," Harris said quietly, "how old are you?" "I'm in my 62nd cycle," Vincent replied, sitting up a little straighter. "Roughly 600 of your Earth years." 600, Harris repeated, shaking his head slowly. "And you look like you're in your prime. No gray hair, no joint pain. If you don't get shot, how long will you live?" "Biological senescence in my species typically begins around the 2000th year, barring catastrophic injury," Vincent said, reciting the demographic data automatically. Harris leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I am 42 years old, Vincent." Vincent blinked. He looked at the deep lines around Harris's eyes, the gray at his temples, the heavy, tired slump of his shoulders. He looked ancient. He looked like a machine that had been run past its red line for a decade. "Humanity's natural lifespan," Harris continued, "is about 80 years, if we're lucky, if we don't get cancer, if our hearts don't give out, if our own cells don't decide to start eating us from the inside." He pointed a finger at the inspector. "You have forever. You can afford to wait 1,000 years for the math to be perfect. You can afford to map a star system by sailing safely through higher dimensions, taking your sweet time because a decade to you is a long weekend." He gestured vaguely toward the engineering bay. "We don't have that luxury. The universe is massive, and our clocks are ticking the moment we're born. We spent our entire history fighting for scraps on a dying rock. By the time we figured out how to look at the stars, we realized we were already late to the party. And we realized that if we played by the rules of the immortals, we would die out before we even made it past our own backyard." "So you built a suicide engine," Vincent said softly. "We built a shortcut," Harris corrected. "Yes, the blender leaks radiation. Yes, it might collapse and swallow this ship one day. Do you know how many human ships just disappear? We lose about 1 in 20. Poof, gone. The singularity hiccups, the duct tape fails, and 100 souls are erased from existence." Vincent stared at him in absolute horror. "A 5% casualty rate on standard transit, and your people accept this?" "We don't just accept it. We volunteer for it," Harris said, pouring himself another measure of bourbon. "Because the alternative is staying in the mud. The alternative is dying slow, safe, and irrelevant. You look at us and see madness. We look at you and see stagnation." He took another sip. "You Dominion folks are like a man who builds a perfect, invincible carriage, but is too afraid of scratching the paint to ever take it out of the garage. We're driving a rusted truck with no brakes, screaming down the mountain, but at least we're getting somewhere." The cynicism in his voice was thick, heavy with the weight of lost crews and radiated flesh. But beneath it, there was an undeniable, terrifying vitality. Vincent looked through the plastic curtain. Dr. Evans was finishing up with Donovan. The massive man spat the rag out of his mouth, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and offered the doctor a weak, pained smile. He was in agony. His skin was ruined. Yet, he stood up, rolled his shoulders, and began walking back toward the engineering bay. He was going back to the machine that had just tried to kill him. "You will burn yourselves out," Vincent said, though the absolute certainty he usually possessed was completely gone. "Maybe," Harris shrugged, "but we'll leave a hell of a fire behind for you to remember us by." Vincent looked down at his empty steel cup. For 600 years, he had believed that civilization was a steady, upward climb toward perfect order. He believed that technology was a tool used to master the universe, to tame it, to make it safe. Humanity didn't want to tame the universe. They knew they couldn't. They knew the universe was a hostile, chaotic void that wanted them dead. So they strapped a collar onto the chaos, kicked it in the ribs, and rode it into the dark. "I need to return to my quarters," Vincent said, standing up. His legs were steadier now, but his mind felt fractured, much like the space around the singularity drive. "You do that, Inspector," Harris said, not looking up. "Try to get some sleep. We jump for the Orion Trade Hub in 6 hours. And this time, We're taking the scenic route." Vincent walked through the dim, buzzing corridors of the Dauntless. The ship still smelled of sweat, coffee, and ozone. It still thrummed with a diseased, frantic heartbeat. But he no longer saw it as a piece of garbage. He saw it for what it truly was. It was a weapon forged by a desperate dying species aimed straight at the throat of a careless universe. And as he lay in his cramped, uncomfortable bunk, listening to the heavy footsteps of human engineers rushing to patch their bleeding reality engine, he realized something that chilled him to his core. The Dominion wasn't going to audit humanity. Humanity was going to audit the Dominion, and they were going to find them lacking. Vincent did not sleep. The cot in his assigned quarters was little more than a slab of dense foam, wrapped in a scratchy, synthetic canvas that smelled of industrial detergent and old sweat. The bulkheads vibrated constantly. The 60 hertz hum of the unshielded lighting fixtures bored into his skull, a relentless audio drill. But it wasn't the noise or the smell keeping him awake. It was the math. He gave up trying to rest after 4 hours. He smoothed his wrinkled Dominion uniform, ignoring the dark stain of his own blood on the collar, and wandered out into the dim corridors. The ship was in its night cycle, meaning the harsh white lights had been dimmed to a sullen, bruised amber. He found Chief Engineer Riley in a cramped mess hall off the main port corridor. She was slumped over a bolted-down metal table, staring at a thick, plastic-cased portable terminal. A mug of that caustic black liquid, coffee, steamed gently next to her elbow. She looked up as he entered, her eyes ringed with dark, heavy exhaustion. "Inspector," she grunted. She didn't offer him a seat. He sat anyway. The metal chair was cold. "Chief Engineer, I require an explanation." Riley rubbed her face, leaving a fresh streak of grease across her cheek. "About what? The valve? Look, Donovan's fine, mostly. He'll have scars, but not the valve," Vincent interrupted. "The math, your drive." He leaned forward, the acidic smell of her coffee stinging his nostrils. "I am a Tier 1 auditor. I have studied the fundamental laws of space-time for 3 centuries. The sheer kinetic friction required to drag a vessel of this mass through real space using a localized singularity. It should generate enough thermal backwash to vaporize this ship instantly. You bleed off the heat, yes. But the conversion rate? How do you calculate the topological shear without the denominator collapsing to 0? Riley stared at him for a long time. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of a coolant pump. Then she barked a short, harsh laugh. She spun her heavy terminal around and shoved it across the table toward him. "Have a look," she said. The screen was cracked, smeared with fingerprints. Vincent squinted at the harsh green text. It was a raw, uncompiled physics simulator. On a Dominion terminal, calculating spatial distortion involved elegant arrays of balanced variables, a symphony of numbers that proved the universe was a closed, predictable system. The standard Einstein field equations dictated the limits of curvature. They relied on R mu nu minus 1/2 R g mu nu plus lambda g mu nu equals 8 pig over c to the power of 4 T mu nu to establish the absolute boundaries of stress energy, maintaining absolute causality. The human equation on the screen was a massacre. They weren't balancing the variables. They were intentionally introducing a paradox. Vincent read the core metric calculation for the singularity's containment shell. his eyes tracking a string of variables that made his stomach turn. ds squared equals minus, open parenthesis, 1 minus 2, gm over rc squared plus q squared over r squared c to the power of 4, close parenthesis, dt squared plus open parenthesis, 1 minus 2, gm over rc squared plus q squared over r squared c to the power of 4, close parenthesis, to the power of minus 1, dr squared plus r squared, open parenthesis, d theta squared plus sine squared theta, d phi squared, close parenthesis, minus f of r, comma, tau, d tau squared. His eyes locked onto the final term. What is this? He pointed a trembling finger at f of r, comma, tau d tau squared. This tensor, it doesn't represent gravitational mass. It represents frictional shear against the temporal axis. You are treating time as a physical medium of resistance. Yep, Riley said, taking a sip of her coffee and grimacing. But you have left the shear variable undefined, Vincent protested, his voice rising. Look at this coefficient. It's blank. The math is incomplete. The moment r approaches 0 at the singularity point, the spatial curvature becomes infinite. The equation breaks. By all known logic, you shouldn't be able to turn that engine on without calculating the exact point of infinite resistance. We don't calculate it, Riley said simply. We guess. Vincent stopped breathing for a second. You guess? We call it the oh shit margin, she explained, leaning back in her chair. The universe is messy, Vincent. If we tried to calculate the exact infinite curvature of the singularity for every jump, we'd be sitting in dry dock until the sun burned out. So, we spin the magnetic cage to generate an arbitrary threshold of countergravity, hit the singularity with heavy isotopes until it screams, and manually bleed the thermal feedback through the physical exhaust manifolds. That is, he couldn't find the word. Insane wasn't strong enough. It was a deliberate, violent defiance of logic. If your guess is wrong by a fraction of a percent, the drive will consume the ship. That's why I'm sitting here at 0400 hours drinking battery acid, Riley said, her voice flattening into a cold, hard pragmatism. I run the simulations based on our current mass and the local stellar density. I get it close enough. And when close enough starts melting the secondary coolant loop, we throw an ape with a big wrench at the problem. She pulled the terminal back, her fingers flying across the greasy keys with brutal efficiency. You think we're stupid, Riley said, not looking up from the screen. You think because we use physical valves and duct tape, we don't understand the forces we're playing with. We understand them perfectly, Inspector. We just refuse to respect them. Vincent sat in the cold, dim room, the vibration of the deck plates sinking into his bones. She was right. The Dominion respected the universe. They moved through it politely, adhering strictly to its rules. Humanity viewed the universe as an obstacle. They didn't want to decipher the laws of physics. They wanted to break them over their knee. Prepare yourself, Riley muttered, hitting a heavy physical enter key that clacked loudly in the quiet room. We jump for the Orion hub in 2 hours, and we're pushing through the dust cloud. The friction is going to be a bitch. The bridge of the Dauntless was a pressure cooker of adrenaline and sour body odor. Vincent was strapped into a jump seat against the aft bulkhead, the restraint harness cutting into his collarbone. He hadn't been invited, but terror is a powerful motivator. He needed to see it coming. Captain Harris sat in the center chair, chewing furiously on a wooden matchstick. At the navigation console, Young Carter's fingers were a blur. "Approaching the Orion Nebula boundary," Carter called out, his voice tight. "Dust density is reading 3,000 particles per cubic centimeter. It's a soup out there, Captain." "Dominion ships take a 3-week detour around this cloud," Vincent said, his voice barely audible over the rising, agonizing whine of the drive spooling up in the belly of the ship. "The micro-abrasions from the interstellar medium—" "We aren't flying through it," Harris said, without turning around. "We're dragging it. Carter, lock the shear vectors. Give me a raw pull." Locking vectors. Spooling the blender to 85%. Containment fields are rattling, sir. "Hold it together. On my mark," Harris said. He raised a hand. The ship shuddered. A deep, agonizing groan of tortured metal echoed through the hull. The overhead lights flickered violently, plunging them into strobing darkness. "Mark!" Carter slammed the button. The transition wasn't a sudden shatter this time. It was a slow, grinding tear. The physical blow to Vincent's chest felt like he had been hit by a grav sled. All the air left his lungs in a violent rush. His vision inverted, the harsh amber lights of the bridge smearing into long, sickening streaks of purple and bruised black. The taste of copper flooded his mouth, so thick he gagged, choking on his own saliva. Outside the forward viewports, the universe didn't just break, it bled. The dense interstellar dust of the nebula, dragged violently into the event horizon of their naked singularity, ignited. A maelstrom of blinding atomic fire washed over the hull. They were pulling 1 billion miles of space toward them, compressing it, crushing it, and riding the fiery friction of its destruction. The tearing sound from the engine room amplified until it wasn't a sound, but a physical assault. Vincent's teeth vibrated so hard his jaw ached. "Heat levels spiking!" Carter screamed over the noise. "Friction is exceeding the oh shit margin. Hull temperatures at 4,000 degrees and climbing." "Bleed it! Push the thermal exhaust!" Harris roared back, gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles were white. Suddenly, a klaxon screamed, a high, piercing wail that cut through the grinding roar of the jump. "Captain!" Lawson, a technician monitoring the engineering feed, yelled from a side console. "We lost the automated dampeners on the tertiary magnetic lock. The cage is destabilizing." "Can Riley fix it?" "She's pinned by the G-force. She can't reach the manual breaker." The deck plates beneath Vincent's boots began to buckle. The purple corona of the singularity wasn't just in the engine room anymore. It was bleeding through the floorboards, casting jagged fractal shadows across the bridge. The ship was being pulled apart. The singularity was expanding, eating its cage. "Where is the breaker?" Harris yelled. "Auxiliary panel 3, aft bulkhead," Lawson screamed, pointing a shaking finger. Vincent looked. It was 3 meters to his left. A heavy red mechanical lever set into a recessed metal box. 3 meters. It might as well have been a light year. The gravitational shear inside the bridge was pulling everything toward the deck. Lawson was slumped over his console, blood streaming from his nose. Harris was pinned to his chair, his face contorted in agony as he tried to unbuckle his harness, his fingers slipping on the heavy canvas straps. They were going to die. The singularity was going to swallow them, erasing them from existence in a microscopic fraction of a second. The elegant, mathematical universe Vincent had known his entire life was going to crush him in the jaws of human madness. He didn't think. He panicked. He hit the release on his harness. The moment the strap snapped back, the artificial gravity of the localized shear slammed him onto the floor. It felt like a boulder had been dropped on his chest. He couldn't breathe. His ribs groaned, a sharp, terrifying crack echoing in his own ears. "Vincent!" Harris managed to choke out. "Don't!" Vincent didn't listen. He was driven by the pure, unadulterated terror of the void. He dug the polished toes of his Dominion boots into the grating. He reached out with his manicured soft hands, grabbing the edge of a bolted-down chair leg, and pulled. The metal bit into his palm, slicing the skin. Blue blood welled up, immediately smearing against the dirty floor. He whimpered, a pathetic, undignified sound. He dragged his body forward, inch by agonizing inch. The heat in the room was blistering, the ambient radiation from the flaring singularity cooking the air. 2 meters. He tasted ash. His vision was tunneling. The purple light flared again, and the gravity shifted violently sideways, slamming his shoulder into the bulkhead. He screamed, the sound lost in the roaring chaos of the jump. He grabbed the grating, his fingernails tearing against the cold, rusted steel. 1 meter. He reached the recessed box. The metal was scalding hot. He didn't have thermal gloves. He didn't have a hardened exoskeleton. He just had flesh. He reached up, his hand shaking violently. He grabbed the heavy red lever. The heat instantly seared his palm, the agonizing smell of his own burning skin filling his nose. He screamed again, a raw, primal noise, and threw his entire body weight downward. The lever clicked into place with a heavy mechanical thud. Instantly, the klaxon cut out. The grinding, tearing sound dropped an octave. The localized gravity stabilized, no longer crushing him against the deck. The violent atomic fire outside the viewport vanished, replaced by the sudden, stunning stillness of standard space. Vincent lay on the floor, curled in a fetal position, clutching his burned, bleeding hand to his chest. His uniform was ruined, soaked in sweat and blue blood. He was hyperventilating, tears streaming down his face. He had abandoned every tenet of Dominion composure. He had crawled like an animal in the dirt to pull a rusted piece of metal. Heavy boots hit the floor next to him. Harris dropped to his knees, his hands grabbing Vincent's shoulders, rolling him over. His face was pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. He looked at Vincent's ruined hand. The skin was blistered white and angry red, slick with blue blood. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't thank him. He just looked Vincent in the eyes, his own eyes wide with the lingering adrenaline of near death. "Welcome to the mud, Vincent," Harris breathed. The medical bay smelled exactly as bad the second time. Dr. Evans wrapped Vincent's hand in thick, chemical-soaked gauze. The pain was a dull, throbbing constant, a grounding reminder of his own mortality. He sat on the edge of the metal table, staring at the stark white bandages. "You'll live," Evans said, her voice dry. "Though I don't have painkillers synthesized for your biology, you'll just have to tough it out." Vincent nodded slowly. The pain was strangely clarifying. "We are docked," she added, tossing a pair of bloody gloves into a metal bin. "Captain says you're needed on the bridge. The locals are getting restless." He slid off the table. His legs held his weight. He walked through the corridors of the Dauntless. The ship was quiet now, the terrible tearing sound replaced by a low, exhausted idle. The crew he passed didn't look at him with suspicion anymore. Jenkins gave him a slow nod. Donovan, his arms wrapped in fresh bandages, tapped his chest with a fist as Vincent went by. He had bled with them. In the primitive, tribal logic of humanity, that meant something. When he reached the bridge, Harris was standing by the forward viewport, his hands clasped behind his back. "Look at that," he said quietly. Vincent stepped up beside him. The Orion Trade Hub was a marvel of the galaxy. It was a massive, sprawling lattice of crystalline spires and glowing orbital rings, hanging in the void like a jewelry box. Surrounding the hub was the Dominion First Fleet, 12 Tier 1 dreadnoughts. They were magnificent, polished obsidian hulls, perfectly symmetrical, silent and imposing. They emanated order, safety, and absolute control. And parked right in the middle of their formation was the Dauntless. Vincent looked at their ship's reflection in the massive mirrored hull of the nearest dreadnought. They looked like a disease. The Dauntless was scorched black from the nebula dust. Coolant was venting from a ruptured pipe on the port bow, freezing into jagged icicles in the vacuum. The hull plates were warped, the cheap synthetic adhesives peeling away. Next to the silent majesty of the Dominion fleet, the human vessel was an insult. "Unidentified vessel," a voice boomed over the bridge's comm system. It was synthesized, perfectly modulated, utterly devoid of emotion. "You have emerged from an unauthorized, unidentifiable spatial rupture. Your vessel is leaking hazardous radiation. Power down your core and prepare for immediate boarding and impoundment." Harris smiled. It was a terrifying expression. He reached out and tapped the comms button. "Dominion Fleet, this is Captain Harris of the UNS Dauntless. We are here for trade. We aren't powering down anything. If you try to board us, my chief engineer is going to get nervous. And if she gets nervous, she might accidentally drop the containment field on our singularity drive. I'm pretty sure a naked black hole opening up in the middle of your formation would scratch the paint on those pretty ships of yours." Silence hung over the comms. Vincent could imagine the absolute chaos erupting on the bridge of the dreadnought. A Tier 2, uncertified species was directly threatening a Dominion fleet with a weaponized paradox. "Captain," the synthesized voice returned, struggling to maintain its flat affect. "That is a Tier 1 violation. We will fire." "You won't have time," Harris said calmly. "We don't spool up. We just drop the floor. Your move." Vincent stepped forward. He placed his bandaged hand on the console, pushing Harris's hand away from the microphone button. "This is Inspector Vincent, clearance code Alpha 79er. Vincent spoke into the mic. His voice wasn't the smooth, authoritative tone of a Dominion auditor anymore. It was raspy. It sounded tired. "Inspector?" The fleet commander's voice returned, laced with shock. "You are aboard that debris?" "I am aboard the Dauntless," Vincent corrected. He looked at Harris. He looked at the grease on the walls, the exposed wiring, the frantic, messy life that pulsed through the deck plates. "Stand down, Commander," he ordered. "Inspector, that vessel is violating 20 separate codes of transit. It is a hazard to the station. We must—" "You must do nothing," Vincent interrupted, his voice hardening. "You will clear a docking path for this vessel. You will authorize full Tier 2 trade privileges, effective immediately." "Sir, I cannot do that without a finalized audit report." Vincent reached into his coat with his good hand. He pulled out his datapad. The screen was still dead, fried by the ambient radiation of the ship's outer corridors. He looked at it for a second, then tossed it onto the deck. "The audit is complete, Commander," Vincent said, staring out the viewport at the perfect, pristine dreadnoughts that suddenly looked very, very fragile. "And what is your evaluation, Inspector?" the commander asked, the confusion evident even through the synthesizer. Vincent took a deep breath. The air smelled of stale coffee, oxidized metal, and raw, bleeding reality. "They are not compliant," he said softly, but clearly enough for the microphone to catch every word. "They do not understand our math. They do not respect our laws. They strap engines of absolute destruction to rusted metal frames and ride them through the dark." He turned to look at Harris. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was just watching the inspector, waiting. "Do not attempt to block them," Vincent told the fleet commander, the weight of the galaxy's changing paradigm settling heavily on his shoulders. "Do not attempt to regulate them, because they do not wait for doors to open, and if you stand in their way—" He looked down at his bandaged hand, remembering the searing heat of the lever, the raw terror of the singularity, the absolute, undeniable power of an ape with a wrench. "They will break the universe to get through you." He took his finger off the button. The comms channel clicked off. Harris stared at him for a long time. The tension on the bridge was palpable. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a crushed packet, and extracted a fibrous matchstick. He stuck it in the corner of his mouth. "Well," Harris said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence, "I guess that makes us official." He turned back to his crew. "Carter, bring us in, nice and slow. Let's not scratch their paint." As the Dauntless limped forward, a battered, bleeding, radiated monster sliding past the pristine dreadnoughts of the Dominion, Vincent realized the truth. The era of elegant math was over. The era of perfect order was dead. Humanity had arrived, and the universe would never be safe again. And there you have it, spacefarers. If Inspector Vincent's harrowing realization that humanity isn't playing by the rules of the cosmos sent a chill down your spine, hit that like button. We don't just explore the universe. We break it over our knee to get where we're going. Subscribe to the channel to catch more incredible stories of human audacity and absolute glorious madness. And make sure to share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. What did you think of the "oh shit" margin? Let me know in the comments below.